Live. Magandang gabi sa inyong lahat. Good evening. And for those of you who are in another part of the country or the world, good day. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lara Zakizek and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And welcome to our virtual panel, The Color Line Belts the World, Race, U.S. Empire, and Children's Literature. As our panel today examines the entanglements of race, colonialism, and imperialism, we wish to open with a territorial acknowledgement. I immigrated from the Philippines as I was drawn to this nation and its narratives of discovery, democracy, and prosperity. But the vital work of Native artists, activists, and scholars have taught me that these narratives are built on histories and ongoing practices of destruction, division, dehumanization, and dispossession. And so with this statement, I humbly acknowledge that I am on Lenni Lenape land. With this statement, I honor the Lenni Lenape, their ancestors, and their ancestral lands, and contemplate my own particular relationships to legacies of violence. I recognize that a statement like this will turn into an empty gesture if it is not accompanied by action. And so I commit and invite others to commit to listening to, learning from, and supporting Indigenous artists, activists, and scholars around the world as they lead movements for truth-telling and reconciliation, environmental and climate justice, sovereignty, and land repatriation. We take our panel's title from W.E.B. Du Bois, who, in writing The Color Line Belts the World, calls attention to the intertwining of racism, white supremacy, and imperialism. Du Bois was an ardent supporter of anti-colonial movements in various parts of the world, and he believed transnational solidarity was necessary in combating what he called the rising tide of white global supremacy. Du Bois also wrote that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, and clearly it remains a problem in the 21st century, with the escalation of white nationalist movements, with the continued expansion of extractive industries whose looting, polluting, and exacerbating of the climate crisis disproportionately affects Black and Brown and Indigenous peoples around the world. So building on these ideas, our panel examines how our cultural narratives, specifically our narratives for young people, are shaped by and respond to the US's empire building projects. Our aim today is to identify not only how institutions of children's literature reinforce US efforts to expand, occupy, extract, and accumulate, but also how children's narratives promote transnational solidarity and contest colonialism, neocolonialism, and coloniality. Now, I also wish to point out that our panel is an expression of self-determination. Black and Indigenous women and women of color are persistently marginalized, minimized, and erased in institutions of children's literature. And in organizing this panel that purposefully centers the knowledge of BIPOC women scholars and critics, we signal our refusal of such occlusion and demonstrate the power of collaboration and collective action in pushing back against manifestations of racism and misogyny in our fields. And I'm also delighted and humbled to have two graduate students participate in this collaborative effort, and especially grateful that they agreed to help us open our event on such short notice. Part of the reason we wanted students to be involved today was we saw this event as an opportunity to provide mentorship to emerging scholars. But in working with Paige and Lee Dong in preparing for this event, I realized that our students do not simply represent the future of our field, they already are fundamental to our field. And so I'm hoping that this panel will blossom into other projects that recognize, celebrate, and center the contributions of our students. So here to help us open our event is Paige Pagan of Lehigh University, who is pursuing her master's degree in English literature with a focus on children's and young adult multicultural narratives in the 20th and 21st centuries. Her research and creative writing are both dedicated to bringing marginalized voices to the forefront and working toward creating a space for authentic narratives to be recognized and validated. She aspires to enter into the publishing industry post-graduation to continue bringing representation to diverse narratives. And also here with us today is Li Dong Shang, who is currently pursuing her PhD in the Department of Childhood Studies at Rutgers University. She's the co-author of a chapter titled Dancing in Reality, Imaginary Narration in Chinese Children's Film in the New Millennium, which appears in the Palgrave Handbook of Children's Film and Television. She has conducted research on newspapers and children's periodicals from the mid-20th century, exploring how ideas of modernity and childhood are negotiated through affect and space. Li Dong is currently working on literary cinematic narratives of Chinese urbanism and girlhood. Paige and Li Dong, welcome and thank you. And Paige, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lara, for your introduction. Welcome, everyone. We just wanted to make a few announcements before the presentations. First, we wish to thank Lehigh University and its Institute on Race and Ethnic Studies Research for generously funding our event and giving the panel organizers the means to compensate our guest speakers. Thank you to Dr. Marisa Jimenez Garcia, the Institute's founding principal investigator and founding director, for facilitating this partnership with the Institute. We also wish to thank Dr. Sonia Alejandra Rodriguez for designing the promotional material and for figuring out the mechanics of creating a virtual space that allows us to reach a wide audience. And to all of you who are here, thank you for your presence, openness, and support. We wanted to let everyone know that we plan to release a transcript of the event within the next few weeks. We are also looking into providing a closed caption recording of the event. We will make sure to share links to these materials on social media and various children's literature listservs. As we wish to prioritize the safety of our panelists and avoid harmful disruptions and interruptions, we are limiting our engagement with our audience. In lieu of an open Q&A session with the audience, the event will conclude with a conversation among the panelists in which they will address prepared questions. The live chat function on YouTube has been deactivated. However, you are able to moderate comments, so we invite you to post in the YouTube comments field. If you are on Twitter, do tweet about the event using the following hashtags: hashtag ColorlineChat2020, hashtag Kidlit, and hashtag US Empire. Now here is Li Dong, who will introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Paige. I'm Li Dong, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. Our panelists come from various fields, including library and information studies, education, childhood studies, and literary studies. Hopefully, their presentations today will not only remind us of the wide range of voices and perspectives in children's literature studies, but also broaden our understanding of the relationships between children's literature, race, and US empire. With that, I will introduce our tonight's speakers. Our first speaker I'm pleased to introduce is Lara Zakizek. Lara is an associate professor of English at the College of Staten Island, City University of New York. Her book, Incorrigibles and Innocence, Constructing Childhood and Citizenship in Progressive Era Comics, received several honors, including the Charles Hatfield Book Prize from the Comic Studies Society and the Eisner nomination for Best Scholarly Academic Work. Her current project examines representations and the role of fossil fuel energy in children's literature. She is currently co-editing with Marek Osiewicz a special issue on children's literature and climate change for The Lion and the Unicorn. Thank you very much, Lara. I'm pleased to introduce our second speaker, Malisa Jimenez Glacia. Malisa is an interdisciplinary scholar specializing in Latino literature and culture. She is an assistant professor of English at Lehigh University. She has a PhD in English from the University of Florida and an MA in English and a BS in journalism from the University of Miami. She was born in Bellarmine, Puerto Rico. Malisa's research on Latinx literature has appeared in Latino Studies, Central, a journal of Puerto Rican studies, The Lion and the Unicorn, and Children's Literature. Her forthcoming book, Side by Side, US Empire, Puerto Rico, and the Roots of American Youth Literature and Culture, examine the history of colonialism in Puerto Rico through an analysis of youth literature and culture, both in the archipelago and in the diaspora. Her dissertation on Puerto Rican children's literature won the 2012 Puerto Rican Studies Association. She is also a Cultivating New Voices Among Scholars of Color Fellowship recipient from the National Council for Teachers of English. She has also served as the reader and consultant for Teaching for Change, Freedom Schools, the Children's Defense Fund, and Sesame Street. Thank you so much for joining us, Malisa. I'm pleased to introduce our third speaker, Alia Jones. Alia is a furloughed senior library services assistant with the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library, a former children's bookseller and English teacher in South Korea. Her work currently focuses on diverse Black and Indigenous children's literature. She blogs at readitrealgood.com and recently completed service on the 2020 Caldecott Award Committee for Most Distinguished American Picture Book for Children. In January 2021, she will join the 2022-23 Corrida Scott King Awards jury. Welcome, Alia. I'm pleased to introduce our fourth speaker, Ebony Elizabeth Thomas. Abney is an associate professor in the Literacy, Culture, and International Education Division at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education, a former Detroit Public Schools teacher and National Academy of Education, Spencer Foundation postdoctoral fellow. She was a member of the NCT Cultivating New Voices Among Scholars of Colors 2008-10 cohort, served on the NCT Conference on English Education's Executive Committee from 2013 until 17. And she is the immediate past chair of the NCT Standing Committee on Research. Currently, she serves as co-editor of Research of the Teaching of English, and her most recent book is The Dark Fantastic, Race and the Imagination from Harry Potter to the Hunger Games. Thanks a lot for joining us, Abney. I'm pleased to introduce our fifth speaker, Sonia Alejandra Rodriguez. Sonia is an associate professor of English at LaGuardia Community College, where she teaches composition, literature, and creative writing. She is a current recipient of the 2020 Mellon Emerging Faculty Leaders Award from the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. She received her PhD in English from the Department of English at the University of California, Riverside in 2015. Her current research project introduces conocimiento narratives as a way to read decolonial healing practices in Latinx children's and young adult literature. Her research has been published in journals like Children's Literature and Children's Literature in Education. She is also a creative writer. All right, let's now welcome our first speaker, Lara.
Thank you so much, Paige and Lee Dong, for the introductions. So I'm gonna set up first. But if we could take just a minute, we had some technical issues. So if you could take those of us who are with us tonight, if you could take some time to retweet and share the new link that is on our that we've been sharing through Twitter. If you could just invite others to join us, that would be great. And I'll take this moment to set up and share my screen. So again, thank you everyone for being here tonight. So I'll just jump right in. So on occasion, an acquaintance would mention to me that they've visited or lived in my home country, the Philippines. And on a few of these occasions, the acquaintance would mention that they were in the Philippines as a US service member or a member of a military family stationed in Clark Air Base or US Naval Base Subic Bay. And to be honest, I'm unsettled by these exchanges, more particularly by the ease by which US military presence in the Philippines is normalized. The speaker often shares these fond memories of the Philippines with me, but I wonder whether they think about how they form these memories as part of an institution that occupied our land, displaced Philippine indigenes, exploited our bodies and labor, contaminated our environment, and flouted our laws. So in these exchanges, what I'm hearing really is a defense of US exceptionalism and manifest destiny, but it's framed through innocence, through this lack of culpability. And I offer that we can gain a better understanding of US colonialism and militarism by engaging with US children's books about the Philippines that were published more than 100 years ago, when the US, quote unquote, acquired the Philippines from Spain via the 1898 Treaty of Paris. So, for example, Mary Hazelton Wade's Alila, Our Little Philippine Cousin, which was published in 1902 as part of the Little Cousin series. Here, the name Alila is particularly arresting because in Tagalog, it means servant, or in some contexts, lackey or follower. So the character's name not only suggests Wade's ignorance of or indifference to the Tagalog language, it also expresses this US fantasy of Filipinos as naturally subservient. And the preface of Alila also includes this passage. Quote, the people of the Philippine Islands are many of them wild and distrustful children. They have no faith in us. They do not wish to obey our laws. And if we are in earnest in our wish to do them good and not harm, we must learn to know them better so that we may understand their needs. So this passage reproduces the image of Filipinos that Rudyard Kipling promotes in his pro-imperialist and racist The White Man's Burden. And in his 1899 poem, Kipling argues that because Filipinos are, quote, half devil and half child, the US was morally obligated to conquer and civilize these wild and infantile people. So Wade's phrasing of our wish to do good and not harm was also in line with President William McKinley's proclamation that the US win the confidence and respect and affection of the inhabitants of the Philippines by proving to them that the mission of the United States is one of benevolent assimilation. And there was certainly nothing benevolent about US denial of Philippine sovereignty. Filipinos had just declared independence from Spain and then found themselves under the thumb of another colonial ruler. When Filipino revolutionaries resisted US presence, the US declared war, and the death toll of the 3-year Philippine-American War was about 4,200 US soldiers, 20,000 Filipino soldiers, and 200,000 Filipino civilians. And the war was brutal, but it was also profitable for US children's publishers and authors. The Philippine American War became a new setting for Bois' adventure narratives. And in titles such as Mary Green Bone Steals the Two Stowaways, which was published around 1900 or 1901, the supposedly wild Philippine archipelago is imagined as a place for white Christian boys to exercise their masculinity and prove their faith. It's also important to highlight that in this book, Bone Steel draws on contemporary anti-Black rhetoric to insist on the inherent savagery of Filipinos. So the novel perpetuates the myth that the leader of the Filipino revolutionaries, President Emilio Aguinaldo, was drawing his strength from supernatural forces. And more specifically, Two Stowaways imagines that Aguinaldo is in alliance with the witch of Tondo, this heathen figure who is described as a huge, as quote, a huge coal black woman of a peculiarly wild, fierce aspect. And so in configuring a Black character as a primary antagonist force in Two Stowaways, Bone Steel at once erases the role of and makes suspect the 7,000 African American soldiers who served in the Philippine-American War. And many of these soldiers, as Timothy D. Russell notes, quote, hope that serving the nation during a time of crisis would provide an opportunity to show that they were worthy of first-class citizenship rights in American society. But the white officers who commanded the African American regiments saw the soldiers as expendable, assigning them the most menial or the most dangerous tasks. And many African American soldiers also felt caught in a dilemma as they aspired for their own advancement, yet also sympathized with Filipinos and their desire for sovereignty. They witnessed white officers and soldiers mistreating Filipinos, saw even like saw white officers calling Filipinos the N-word. So really, they were seeing with their own eyes what Du Bois observed, that the problem of the color line was a global issue, that the color line not only ran across the US, but belted the world. And a few African American soldiers were so affected by this dilemma that they deserted. And there are cases, especially the one that's most well documented, that of David Fagan. Soldiers defected and joined the Filipino resistance. So I'm gonna make this jump here. So it's really incredibly unfortunate that there's very little reference to U.S.-Philippine historical and current relations in children's and YA books in both the U.S. and the Philippines. And so in these last few minutes, I would like to focus on at least on this one title that does allude to the U.S. colonization of the Philippines, Randy Ribai's 2019 Patron Saints of Nothing. So in this novel, Ribay exposes how many U.S. Americans, including his protagonist Jay, who has Filipino heritage, know very little about the U.S. colonization of the Philippines. But what I want to particularly focus on is how in Patron Saints, it is Jay's uncle, his Tito Maning, a policeman who helps enact President Rodrigo Duterte's violent and anti-poor war on drugs, um, is the in this book, he's the most Maning is the most vocal critic of U.S. imperialism. So Jay's uncle could be then understood as a stand-in for Duterte, who is often described as anti-U.S. I do want to say here that it's worth arguing that Duterte often expresses U.S. Anti-U.S. sentiments, but it's part of his cultivating this image of a strong man. But he does often act in alignment with U.S. priorities. So going back to the character of Manning in Patron Saints, so despite his seeming anti-colonial sentiments, Manning exercises and maintains power through force and oppressive practices, just like Duterte. So in short, Patron Saints illustrates coloniality. So while the Philippines technically gained independence from the US in 1946, the vestiges of US colonialism continue to shape the lives of and are even reproduced by Filipinos. So indeed, policing practices in the Philippines are rooted in US imperial policing. In the 1900s, the US established the Insular Constabulary, which was later renamed the Philippine Constabulary. And under the command of US officers, Filipino soldiers were tasked to police fellow Filipinos. The Philippine Constabulary evolved into what we now call the Philippine National Police. And under Duterte, the PNP, along with the military and vigilante death squads, is tasked to intimidate, arrest, and even kill so-called threats to the nation, including suspected drug users, farmers and workers attempting to organize, land and environmental activists who are protesting development projects, and journalists and critics who speak out against the current administration. So in my quick presentation, I moved quite vertiginously between the early 20th century and the 21st century, between the Philippines and the US, between the personal and the political. And my intent is to point to how making such connections can reveal the ways racial and colonial violence built the world. Such study, I hope, clarifies the urgency of transnational knowledge building and solidarity. And I look forward to expanding on these ideas after we conclude all the presentations. But for now, I wish to thank everyone for listening. Maraming salamat po. I'm sorry, and I'm going to hand it over to Marilisa.
Hey there. Thank you so much, Lara. That was beautiful and powerful. And I'm excited that a lot of the things that you said actually coincide with some of the things that I've been looking at and we'll be sharing tonight as well. For those of you who know me, you know I talk about Puerto Rico all day, every time. And because it's Puerto Rico to the world, right? It's a transnational conversation of how, especially Puerto Rico with its experience of still being a colony of the United States, right? How this great democracy has this colony and like, you know, what that means and how often it gets left out of the conversation about the United States, about even, you know, Latino literature and just all the different ways that these conversations get lost. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things, and I hope to end sort of like with gestures toward like, where can we go, you know, and I'm hoping to talk about that also, obviously also with my colleagues. But I would like to share my screen, so I'm gonna do that. I'm just gonna walk us through some things. Really, that's my desire today, is really just to walk us through some stuff. So right here is sort of a picture that I like to use to talk about like the different ways that I talk about resistance and also like writing, you know, in terms of thinking about young people, youth literature and culture, which is what I usually use in terms of thinking about like a term. So you see here, there's the image on the bottom left is Pedro Pietri, Puerto Rican obituary. And he wrote that poem. I don't know how many of you know this, but he wrote that poem when he was 16 years old. So it's interesting that he writes that at 16 and he performs that at a Young Lords party, you know, rally, right? And so sort of like Young Lords party that's right across from, or I guess like across, juxtaposed, you get my drift. Right across from here, right, you have the Young Lords party, who also wrote a lot of, their own newspapers, created their own periodicals to document their resistance, and also created their own curriculum, to make up for what they didn't see themselves in books and didn't see themselves in the New York City curriculum, in particular in Chicago as well. And then you have sort of like the more pop culture moments, right, that we could look at in terms of like Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton. I specifically talk about him when he goes to Puerto Rico and performs Hamilton, and sort of like the irony of saying, we got to rise up, we got to rise up. Well, yeah, okay, but like it's a colony, right? So if you really rose up in Puerto Rico, what does that mean? And actually we have risen up, and actually it meant the death of many and the imprisonment, right, of folks who dared to believe that you could be a sovereign nation. So, some of the things that I'll be talking about today, I think have to do with also like the ways that our resistance is not just like seen as a problem, but it's actually seen as like anti-American violence. And it's seen as a crime. It's criminalized, and our literature as well has been criminalized and banned in many ways for these same reasons. So it's sort of like the parallels between our bodies and our literatures. Obviously, I take my story from similar to you, Lara, where it's like, 1898 to like 21st century, we got to do those jumps. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that it's understood that people don't know the story, right? So we got to start from like, let me take you to 1898, and sometimes even before then, because it's assumed that people in the room will not know, and so part of what I'm hoping to see more in the future is like, we got to know. It can't just be on us continually to have to restart that story, and at what point do we as scholars really take it upon ourselves to say, what, US empire is a thing. It's not just like, a narrative and a fiction. So I teach a course called American Childhood at Lehigh, and I taught it last year. It was a really interesting moment because I think it gave us this opportunity to work with the concept of even like America, right? American, and to think of it like from the perspective of a Latin Americanist or Latino studies person, which is what I am, a scholar, the word America, like when we say that word, like what are we really thinking, right? If we're thinking about like Jose Marti, for example, who wrote about that, the Our America, Nuestra America, right? This idea of the United States, South America, Central America, all as one piece. Now, mind you, that's coming from a Spanish imperial, perspective of like, right, kind of erasing the indigeneity, and even Blackness as well. But this idea of like what's invoked when we say America, right? And to think of American children. In this particular class, I actually say, we're only going to center children of color. So, people who come to the class like, yo, we're going to read Little House. It's like, no, we're not. We're not reading Little Women either. We are only going to be reading from the perspective of children of color, and also understanding how they came to be in the United States, so that it's not just this idea of like the nation of immigrants, right? That it is about the reality of land occupation, about children being taken from their families, indigenous children being taken from their families. And also, part of the US used to be Mexico, right? There's so many Puerto Ricans in certain areas of the country because it's occupied land. It's not just a question of like, oh, people came here looking for a better life. So we go through a lot of different stories and storybooks about that, and really also looking at the US as competing settler colonial projects as well. So, France, Spain, right? Britain, all sort of coming together in terms of land. Why is it that we only remember or decide to remember sort of like Anglo-British history when we really sit down to make a canon even? Okay, so sort of questioning those stories. We don't learn a lot about something called the Monroe Doctrine, which is something I want to make sure I talk about in terms of this perspective on US empire. Right, 1823, the US decides that this is a policy that they're going to enact in terms of wanting to control the Western Hemisphere. And I really love this cartoon because you sort of have like Uncle Sam, you know, kind of like looking at the other colonizers from the other side, kind of like, you know, and they're already kind of fat, if you notice, like, so they've had their moment, right? So it's like England, Spain, you know, they've already done their thing. And here's Uncle Sam, and he's getting ready to do what he does in the 20th century. And before that, I would also say, so, you know, really understanding this idea of, and disrupting this idea of exceptionalism, right? That the US didn't sort of start a new civilization that was completely, you know, without class. And why is it that we have this idea of like the benevolent conqueror, right? So that even how that is used to mask. So something that gets interesting too, even when I start talking about Latino literature, Latinx literature, is because of different racial paradigms, right, coming together, Spanish colonialism, US colonialism, and this idea of this really problematic idea of mestizaje. We have things that get left out of what is seen as Latinx and what is marketable as Latinx in the US. And so what happens is eventually anti-Blackness, you know, is basically what you're gonna have. So that people who are organizing around the term Latinx often become part of the imperial project by erasing Blackness, especially, and by sort of getting into a really kind of not nuanced conversation and thinking of Latino sort of like as a race, you know, as opposed to as an ethnicity, and really not looking at issues of national histories. So I'm always pushing for that in the work that I do. But I have to say, in the work that I've been doing, it has been very complicated to get beyond that. And even within my own Latinx community, for people to not sort of acknowledge that this is a thing and that it needs to be resisted. So, you know, rethinking US empire through a Latinx lens, the centering of the US as a settler colony rather than a nation of immigrants, and understanding that the Latinx population in the US is a harvest of empire, as Gonzalez wrote in Harvest of Empire, Juan Gonzalez. And, you know, this is interesting because the US Academy upholds this tradition of American exceptionalism, particularly veiling literatures of 19th through 21st century colonialism, especially indigenous and Latinx literatures. And if you think about it, these are the two kinds of literature that mostly have a hard time getting a course in an English department, especially. You know, they're sort of like the most undertaught, marginalized literatures. And I think, you know, there's issues of language also here to think about in terms of racialization, right? And when we're dealing with the Latinx community, you also have to remember that race and language interplay and cause racializations to happen, which is what Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores remind us of. Going back to this idea of criminalization, my career kind of came up around, you know, 2012 is when I got out of grad school. And it's interesting because it was around that time that you had the ban on ethnic studies, the HB 2281 Mexican American studies specifically, right, in Arizona, which is around the same time as the Show Me Your Papers law as well. So this idea of like how Latino ways of knowing have been seen as like non-existent, impoverished, criminal, and contraband, right? In the same way that a lot of our young people's bodies have been as well, right? This idea of like, it's illegal, you're illegal, right? So parallels between also how our knowledges are seen as, again, as anti-American. And I go to what's happening even this weekend, right? Where you have the president basically saying critical race theory is something that we need to like have a whole like commission on, like, hey, that can't be going on. So not just like, hey, you feel some kind of way about it, but actually enacting laws to say this is not going to go any further, and young people are not going to be learning this, or we're not going to be able to enact this in our institutions, even when we are sort of saying we want to be anti-racist. Like, what are we going to do, right? If there's a policy that says, hey, you actually can't by law teach these things. And I kind of want to end with a self-reflection that I'm kind of going through myself. And I've been doing this in terms of working on the Council on Interracial Children's Books, or books for children. One of the things I've been looking at is, you know, even with the buzzwords today, like, right, anti-racism, everybody's like, we gotta be anti-racist though. And it's like, okay, we gotta be anti-racist, but like, you know, I always say this, but like, what about anti-sexist? That, like, you know, the fact that we're focusing this idea on race doesn't mean we're not gonna somehow be complicit in like other patriarchal structures, right? And like classism and elitism and other kinds of things. And I think it's really interesting that the Council on Interracial Books for Children in 1976 had this graphic that they shared in the book Human and Anti-Human Values that has this like matrix of children's literature, which I think is really interesting. Like before people maybe were even using terms like intersectionality, right? Which I know has also been really important for thinking about women of color, especially, and the law. But even thinking about like in our children's literature world, like what are we really doing, right? To say, when we're focusing on this one particular thing, like what are we not focusing on? What are we not really seeing? And how can we maybe perhaps model something like transnational solidarity, which is actually a stance that the council took back in 1976, actually 1966 when they formed. Okay, so I'm gonna end on this note. And this is, again, part of the self-reflection that I am having recently. And this is sort of like a subway analogy, which I use with my students sometimes, especially when we're talking about theory. You know, it's kind of one of these things like, what train are you on? If you get, you know, on the A train, you're gonna end up in Brooklyn, right? So, you know, don't expect to get on this train and end up someplace else. And I wanna ask us, you know, are you on the diversity train? Because I know for sure, I've been asked to be on the train, you know, especially I would say, like I said, my career kind of parallels the We Need Diverse Books movement, you know, all these different things that happen. And you got to kind of get a sense of like, hey, this is where the visibility is, right? Authors and scholars, a lot of us, you know, kind of like, hey, diversity is the word. We might be moving along with this, you know. And I got off the train. I got off the train because I found it to be a replication basically of colonial violence in many ways, because it's a corporate term. It's not a critical lens, okay? It's not an honor to our ancestors and our communities that have fought for these knowledges to be part of the university. So I would say in the future for me as a scholar, what I'm interested in seeing is an investment in critical race theory, in ethnic studies and Black feminist pedagogies and praxis, to make sure that we are not replicating colonial violence, and that we're not replicating especially anti-Black racism. Because I think if there's one thing that we've seen is that diversity doesn't get us any further away from anti-Blackness. And I think that that's part of the reason why we're seeing so many associations and so many things implode. You know, there's not a commitment to praxis. There's not a commitment to really getting behind what's at the root of colonialism and racial capitalism. And with that, I leave you. Till the next time.
Thank you so much, Marilisa. And let's hand it off to Alia.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Let me share my screen. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. So my presentation today is called Native Voices Rising, Building Stronger Library Collections for Our Children. Okay, so stereotype and racist imagery have been a part of the US nation building project since its inception, and Native American children's literature, until rather recently, was dominated by the white gaze. Our library collections are built and maintained by gatekeepers who may or may not embed equity, diversity, and inclusion and anti-racism into their practices. Therefore, the library collection can be a very powerful tool of white supremacy. So I'm going to start by talking about Native representation in children's literature as an extension of Doctrine of Discovery and Manifest Destiny. So Doctrine of Discovery led to Manifest Destiny, led to American settler colonialism. And all of these are aspects of white supremacy, or the belief that white people have a God-given right to explore, to expand, and to create a great nation. And children's books are intended to educate and instill values early. And racist and stereotypical imagery, especially in early American children's literature, was deliberate. That's really important to remember. This literature was crafted to foster bias and racial hierarchy early, kind of making sure that white kids especially understood there's a difference between being a savage and being civilized. So I wanted to show some images. I think images are important to relaying a message. So at the top left corner, we have, Washington Redskins. We have the mythical Pocahontas from the Disney movies. We have Chief Wahoo of Cleveland Indians. We have Jacob from the Twilight series. We have Magua from The Last of the Mohicans. And the bottom left corner, I wanted to include this comic because I think it's really important. We have this white boy looking at this Native girl with all these stereotypes of what he thinks an Indigenous person looks like. And he says, "Really? You don't look like an Indian." In the middle of the presentation, we have two seals. These are seals of a town called Whitesboro in upstate New York. The original one is on the left and the updated one is on the right. And it portrays the founder of the village. His name was Hugh White, and he is, quote unquote, wrestling with an Oneida chief. I could not for the life of me figure out and find the name of this chief. And you can see the updated version of the seal on the right. And last but not least, we have Peter Pan with Tiger Lily and her dad, who literally has red skin. And I kind of want to move from pop cultural images into the literary. So on the left, we have just a few instances of racist and stereotypical Native imagery in literature. At the top, these are both from Little House on the Prairie series, illustrations by Garth Williams. You can see the stoic Indian on the left, and just for a little razzle dazzle, we've got some blackface in Little House on the Prairie. If you're looking for more info about Little House on the Prairie, I do recommend Dr. Debbie Reese's work on that book. In the middle, we also have good old Clifford in a war bonnet, quote unquote, with a pipe. And we also have kind of like a stereotypical image of 10 Little Indians from the 70s. And to the right, we have Let's Be Indians, which is by Peggy Parrish of the Amelia Bedelia fame, and Arnold Lobel. But what I really want to talk about are the books on the right, because these books are kind of what really make our collection. They are books about Indigenous peoples that are written by white authors and illustrators. These books fill our collections. These stories being told by people not of Native cultures or what are on our shelves. So as I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking about how it seems as if we have the idea of Native childhood is dangerous, because it's really important to remember that the policing of Black, Brown, and Indigenous children and their childhoods is nothing new. It's foundational to this country. Indigenous childhood was seen as dangerous to the project of nation building because Native kids would grow up to challenge the settler state. So there was a mission to civilize and assimilate and Americanize Native children. We cannot forget the violent history of boarding and residential schools in the US and Canada. Captain Pratt, founder of Carlisle, said, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." And because of these experiences, we have intergenerational trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of children being sent to these militarized schools that were far away from their families and communities. And I wanted to mention also the importance of ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act of '78, because this act helped combat the fact that so many Native children were being stolen away from their homes and placed in non-Native foster families. Check out the documentary Dawnland. So this got me thinking about, well, what do we publish? We publish white childhoods, both realistic and fantastic. We're gonna go back to this graphic, which I think at this point, a lot of people have seen, but it's really important. This graphic is from data from the Cooperative Children's Book Center out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Every year they collect data on diverse books. And as you can see to the right, white children see themselves infinitely reflected. It's also important to note that this image is based on the term Windows, Mirrors, and Sliding Glass Doors by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. And if we move to the right, we have books about animals, Black children, Asian Pacific Islander kids, Latinx kids, and to the very left, a very small percentage of books that represent Native kids. And it's also important to notice that there's a cracked mirror, which means that even though we have this representation, that doesn't mean that it's accurate and correct. That's a very important part and detail of this really powerful image of diversity in children's books. So we have a lot of work to do. And even though this is from 2018 and the new stats are out for 2019, not much has changed. Not much has changed at all. So I want to think about if the work we do is truly for children, it's our responsibility to strengthen our library collection. So I'm going to focus on libraries for the rest of this. So I'm thinking about how the library and library collection is a colonized space and tool of white supremacy. We must look at the collection as potentially harmful to BIPOC youth. What stereotypical and racist classics are sitting on our shelves? Like, we really have to think about that question. How can we challenge the whiteness of our children's literature canon? What is a canon? What does our community want to see in our collections? And it's important to note that intentionally avoiding these gaps in representation can be violence. People say things like, we don't have a large Native population, but isn't it censorship to take an item off the shelf and or cut it out of the collection? No, it's not. Continuing that thought, libraries are not neutral. They never have been. They are racialized spaces in a settler state. Libraries are centers of Western knowledge and research, and they are built on philosophies rooted in white supremacy. It's also important to note that many public libraries in the US were actually founded to aid in the Americanization and citizenship of European white immigrants. So that's the beginning of most of our public libraries. I also wanted to note, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, that when I speak of libraries in this talk, I'm mostly meaning libraries in predominantly white institutions. And we can't forget the history, of course, of segregation in libraries and the gatekeeping of information. In general, we must work toward decolonizing the library profession and library spaces. So let's talk about bias and racism in collection development. Librarians are gatekeepers, and library information science is extremely white, extremely. Librarians choose what to buy, what to keep, what to weed out, what to display, and what to highlight through their programming and outreach. The Eurocentrism of library collections and Dewey Decimal Classification also must be mentioned. Very Eurocentric. And also the public has a tendency to romanticize the profession. And honestly, so do librarians, because if you check out the term vocational awe by Fobazi Attar, like, she's brilliant. There's this myth of librarians as rebels. We like to portray white, straight, cisgender, non-disabled women librarians as more radical than they actually are, to be quite honest. And we have to also think about what is a library's responsibility to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and anti-racism in collection development. So all this being said, how do we make change? I think that diversity audits of library collections and careful, sensitive maintenance is key. We must diversify the staff of acquisitions departments and collection development teams in order to bring in more diverse perspectives and lived experiences. We need more Black, Indigenous, POC, and libraries and library school, period. We really do. And they need to be supported and helped to get there. We need to directly address systemic racism in our library field. Like, when you're studying the field of library science, we need to address it then. We also need to address it in our library spaces and also in library administration. We also need to respect Indigenous knowledge and information as equal to Western knowledge and information. We have to start with that as the baseline. We also should push back against centralized buying practices to allow location-specific curation. This is a big one to me, because a lot of library systems are starting to move from allowing smaller branches to make their purchasing on their own, and they're starting to require centralized buying. And when that happens, it takes power out of the community to be able to decide what their community wants, what those individual librarians know about their community's needs. We have to always have community involvement and feedback. That's crucial. We have to support tribal libraries. We really do. And we always, as we're evaluating materials, we have to practice critical literacy of children's literature, and we must value intersectionality. We're not all one thing, we are multifaceted. And those experiences should be reflected in our books, in the books that we put into our library collections. And finally, Native voices rising. We must research and prioritize own voices Indigenous children's literature, and we must purchase these materials in various formats for all types of children: large print, audio, playaway, ebooks, wonder books, and print. And yeah, that's about it for me. I'm gonna show this page with all the images just so that we can have that taken care of. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Alia. And now let's pass on the mic to Ebony.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me as part of this panel tonight. I'm not going to be before you long. Some of you have heard some of this material before. And one of the things that I have found is that when you are a scholar of color, particularly a mid-career scholar of color, people expect you to have all of your ideas fully formed immediately. And there, it takes time to sort of develop ideas and to take in new information, including critique. So today I've talked a little bit about critique. And so I'm really starting to think about the space of Black American imagination in this shadow book tradition, but I'm not going to talk so much about the shadow book today. I want to talk about Black America and our hypervisibility within US empire. I have some pieces pending about this, thinking about both children's and young adult literature, as well as science fiction and fantasy. So the charge of Wakandification as Black creatives get certain kinds of resources because of our people's very hypervisibility within the United States context. Sometimes I believe that gets mistaken for power. And I do think that, we need to be very careful that such critiques don't fall down the rabbit hole of anti-Blackness. Let me say more about what I mean. So the Black American story is one that many people feel that they already know, and there's nothing else there. There's nothing else new to tell. But strangely, we're starting to see a lot of that story that everyone knows be suppressed, censored, and tamped down, both here within our nation and outside of it. So first of all, To Kill a Mockingbird is not children's or young adult literature. It was written for general adult audiences. It is taught, over-taught, many of my colleagues in English language arts would say. And yet, and still, we still see this book on banned book lists. I have this question. If the Black American meta-narrative, which I also kind of bristle at because, there's not just one story. If that story is a story that everyone knows and that has been, part of this US imperial project, is it one that we control? And is it one that, is also subjected to erasure, marginalization, and the same kinds of imperial colonial moves that happen to other groups of folks? So To Kill a Mockingbird continues to be censored. So does the 1619 Project, as we saw. Another challenge is that Black hypervisibility in not only the culture and in US curriculum, but also in children's literature leads to people not really seeing us. So we're here, we're always here. We are exhaustingly depressingly always here, in your face, right here. Look at us, see? But does it do us any good, right? So after centuries of Black characters being narrated through not only racist white creators' stories, particularly before 1965, but certainly not limited to that, pre-civil rights time period. We certainly see this ongoing persistence of racism and anti-Blackness in US published children's literature. We also see several challenges that I have argued lead to misperceptions of who Black children and teenagers are in our collective imagination. So I'm still thinking through this stuff. I want to know why people just don't like Black people or Black characters in stories. Certainly, the argument has been made and is increasingly made, well, 10% of the books are, own voices Black books. You're only 13% of the population. That's almost parity. But Black characters, settings, and narratives aren't seen as likable or relatable. When you put Black characters in certain settings, sometimes the charges made that we are just imitating white people. We're pretty much white, American folk here. There's also something I don't have time to talk about, which is sort of this quantum issue that Black people don't belong in certain points of space and time. So I need more room to talk about that. And then finally, I made up a word that I debuted at this NCTU presentation I did this summer. I don't know if I want to call this keeping it real, but I'm not convinced that the Afrofuturistic Renaissance has liberated Black child and teen characters away from this imperative that we always need to be teaching people, serving people, or existing for some other purpose other than childhood play. So I think it plays into the adultification of Black kids. And that's something that I've learned about through Black girlhood studies work and have been reading more about lately as I'm trying to pull together this book proposal. Black characters everywhere in US children's literature. However, we tend to only show up in certain ways. I have this joke, I may even call a chapter this, the 5 Black kids you meet in US children's books. I can't speak for all over the place, but man, I value and honor my enslaved ancestors, but I felt as if, as a kid, and now as a critic and professor, these are the categories. So especially, these are the categories. Enslaved or surviving segregation or perpetually fighting for our humanity, stereotypical, magical, and not in a good way, like, yes, Black girl magic, not that way, magical Negro characters, that's what I meant. Deviant and or adultified. So that really matters, because if Black hypervisibility and overcoming over the past 50 years really achieved what some are arguing it has, we would not have lived through the summer that we just lived through, where Black people were murdered on camera and no justice, no peace has been had. All this time later. All right, I know we don't have much time. So this persistent problem of Black hypervisibility within US empire is a problem. It is very much the case that Black folks have been complicit with, some Black folks have been complicit sometimes with US imperialism, colonialism, etc. We have examples of that throughout history. However, by narrating that Black folks are complicit at the expense of all other complicity and thinking about the calculations that some folks had. So we have questions that we need to ask about Black character agency, or, like what does the character have, what choices are set between, for that character. I ask along with Toni Morrison, what do you do when you're both the haunted and the haint? So that hypervisibility means that we sort of blur in weird ways in the imagination, so that are we really being seen, or is something else being seen that's not really us? So what do we do when our presence is the ever-present shadow of the US American imagination? So America has lots of countries in it. So the United States imagination. What do we do? So people see us in stories and in the collective imagination in a really messed up way. Well, how do we see ourselves? Like at the heart of it, not just what we are able to publish, which has always been through the filter of the white mainstream imagination from the time of that our enslaved ancestors had to have a white sponsor in order to publish the slave narratives, all the way through the modern mainstream publishing industry, where we have to get that narrative through an agent, through an editor, and then through reviewers, and a landscape that sometimes doesn't understand us. It understands the caricature, but not us. How do we see ourselves? I am really delving into and sitting with the work of Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. Her first book, Shadow and Substance, Afro-American Experience in Contemporary Children's Fiction, is something that I think we should go back and teach more in our children's literature classes, especially on the graduate level. But there are also other scholars of Black US children's literature who don't get taught as often, who don't get talked about as often. The title of Shadow and Substance is a reference to Sojourner Truth. I sell the shadow to support the substance. I would argue that what people are seeing and noting as hypervisible in both children's stories and in the collective imagination is the shadow of Blackness. It's the shadow storytelling tradition. It's what we've been able to sell in order to support our substance. And I want to close with, sort of the past, present, and future. So we have this rich past legacy. We're celebrating a century since the Brownies book. And there's been various commemorations, but there have been so many milestones of Black children's literature. These are just a few of my favorites, but I could have layered this slide and many others with so many landmarks. So do not mistake my words of caution as ingratitude or, taking for granted how deep the body of literature has become. I am grateful. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us, as James Weldon Johnson wrote 120 years ago. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. So these are just some books from, and of course, I know I'm sitting on MBAs this year, but it's a little more loose than the ALA YMAs, and everything's in, but these are books that are non-2020 books that I have talked about in other presentations. So again, our anthem goes, sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I do think I need to continue sounding the alarm. There are many resources for teaching Black US children's and YA Lit. A lot of this material is not in children's and young adult literary criticism for reasons that I'm hoping to discuss over the next few years. And finally, sometimes I close presentations with David Drake, Brian Collier's amazing illustrations for the picture book, Dave the Potter, artist, poet, slave, or something that I just really resonate with me. But I want to transmute slave to ancestor, because I think it's so important for us to continue building on the past, realize that the battle is not already won, and that if we are to be the hyper visible ones within US empire and United States children's literature, let us march on till victory is won in solidarity with others here and all around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ebony. And last but certainly not least, we have Sonia Alejandra Rodriguez.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be part of this presentation or this panel. I'm going to try to share my screen. I am now realizing that as I'm sharing my screen, I can't see my notes because you will also see my notes. So now I'm just going to try to wing it and see what happens. First of all, I want to thank Lara for the idea to have this panel in the first place. I want to thank my fellow panelists for their commitment to this conversation, to Paige and to Li Dong for introducing us, for being here, and for all of you for being here, watching, and participating in this conversation with us. The title of my presentation vaguely is Immigration and Chicanx and Central American Children's Literature. I will be speaking on particular texts that demonstrate the connection between immigration and US empire. By no means am I giving you a holistic, complete conversation of what that connection is. And I'm definitely not going to be talking about every Central American country. I have an example from El Salvador and an example from Guatemala. And so again, I just want to emphasize that what you're witnessing today is like a start to a conversation that needs to continue, right? We're not offering complete answers, and we certainly don't have that, but I think one of the reasons that we've decided to come together is because these conversations weren't happening in terms of examining US empire and children's literature. So again, it's the conversation. If you want to continue this conversation, definitely invite us to your campus and pay us. All right. So again, I'm Sonia Alejandra Rodriguez. I'm an associate professor at LaGuardia Community College. One of the ways that I enter this conversation in thinking about US imperialism is trying to highlight a healing practice and healing processes in Latinx children's literature. And again, I say or use Latinx quite understanding how problematic and how deeply rooted it is in like US like structural imperial projects. But as Ebony mentioned earlier, right, it's an ongoing project. I'm still a growing, learning scholar as we continue and should continue to be. And so just as Latinx studies is growing, so is my research. So as I mentioned, I enter an examination of US empire by focusing on healing practices. And so what I call this lens or this view, I call them conocimiento narratives. And so that's me trying to read realist fiction in Latinx children's and young adult literature as tools that highlight like a healing process. And so I get this term from Gloria Anzaldúa. Conocimientos is a term from Gloria Anzaldúa. And so as my attempt to define this, I've defined this in two separate articles. So when I refer to conocimiento narratives in Latinx children's and young adult literature, I mean to highlight how knowing is a healing process captured within the stories and exemplified through the characters. Conocimiento is an opportunity to recognize the oppressions that direct the character's existence and provide a means to challenge and transform them. And this is from my article, Conocimiento Narratives, which came out, I believe, last summer in children's literature under the guidance of Malisa Jimenez Garcia. So definitely check that out. In another article, I say that conocimiento narratives are a way to examine the use of alternative knowledges, right? And several of the panelists have mentioned that it is important that we highlight our knowledge, that we situate our lenses. And Ebony asked the questions, how do we see ourselves? And so I'm definitely trying to highlight alternative knowledges to oppressive like US imperial epistemologies using Latinx children's literature. And so like a more practical use is that I believe that conocimiento narratives can be a way to bridge the text and Chicana Latina or Chicanx Latinx readers, even if it's only in a literary space, right? So that they can see themselves represented and overcoming struggles, right? And that in itself can have an empowering moment of agency. So I mentioned that I'll be speaking on immigration. In this presentation, I won't be showing you images that might come to mind that are very recurring and repetitive when we think about immigration in the US, right? So babies in cages, mothers and children being gassed at the US border, the separation of families. But even if you just like already knew what that picture was in your head, I think that that is a clear example of US empire, right? That we do not need to see the image to know what the symptoms or the consequences or what US empire feels like, right? And so I'm not gonna show you that, but instead I want to highlight, as I mentioned earlier, highlight texts that I think challenge US imperialism and US empire projects. The very first one, I don't know if you saw on my screen, my thing says fuck ICE. And so that's just something I want to reiterate. That is something I want to highlight, right? And this is by an artist, Yesenia Rivas, because if there's any doubt on where I stand and what we should do, I just wanted to make that clear, right? Fuck ICE. Yay. So the first text that I'm going to highlight is Jorge Argueta's Caravan to the North, Misael's Long Walk. And I highlight this text because with US empire, US imperialism, there's this misconception that when folks, particularly when folks in Central America are migrating, there's this astounding like American exceptionalism, right? That they're leaving their terrible countries for number one USA, right? And that's not the case at all. And so what I appreciate about Argueta's book is that the character Misael and the other characters that are traveling with him in this caravan talk about how much they love El Salvador, right? That they are being forced to leave. And so I'm going to read this first passage from the very opening of the book. And it's written in poetry. And I know there's a term for that, but I am forgetting that right now. It says, "My name is Misael Martinez. I've come to join the caravan that's leaving tomorrow from the Plaza Divino Salvador del Mundo to the north. I'm going with my family. We decided to leave because you can't really live in my village anymore. There's no work, there's no way to get by. What there is violence, gangs." And so this first passage here is highlighting the very real reasons why folks immigrate. And so when we think about folks from Central America migrating, you cannot detach the connection or the role that the US has had in that movement, right? Like they need to go together. Anytime you think about or watch in the news or see all of these, or there's debates about Central Americans coming into this country, it is because the US has fucked up the country and they're coming to our country and then we're kicking them out, right? We are denying them asylum, which is illegal, right? We are conspiring with Mexico to do the same. And so I think anytime that you read, whether it be through like Latinx children's literature or however it is that you're thinking about Central American migration, it needs to also be paired with thinking about the role of like US intervention, US imperialism in these countries. And so again, as I mentioned, one of the reasons that I like Argueta's Caravan to the North is because he highlights so much about what Misael and those traveling in the caravan are going to miss about their country, right? And Argueta does this in a very emotionally beautiful, descriptive way throughout the book. And this is only one example. And it says, "I love my country so much. I love the plants, the fields, see the corn come up and the little beans sprout. Every year in May, the whole family gets the land ready for planting. We do the weeding, fertilizing. We pray for the good crop, and then the first rains fall. We get up here before sunrise and feel happy when we put the best of the corn and the beans in our Mother Earth. And so I highlight this passage in particular, not only just because I said I think it challenges this misconception that, or this American exceptionalism that folks are leaving their country and that USA #1, but also to highlight that happiness is not at the end of the migration journey, right? That it's that, how do I say this in a different way, right? That happiness doesn't just start when immigrants get to the United States, right? That that immigrants have lives, have a whole ass happiness without the US, right? And that the reason that a lot of immigrants are migrating is, again, because of the US intervention that has damaged their way of life, that has made it impossible, right, to succeed. And I mean, again, just listen to the rhetoric of our current government thinking about violence in Central America and how that's being represented in the US, in particular with gangs, right? And these gangs are not just route out of nowhere, right? But again, the US had a hand in that. And then we punish folks seeking asylum for the violence that we created. Another book that I want to highlight is a recent book, We Are Not From Here by Jenny Torres Sanchez, particularly because what I appreciate about this book, and if you haven't read it, I recommend it. And I also recommend that you check out my review of it in Latinx Kidlit, because I talk a lot about what I'm about to say here, but in a little bit more detail. So We're Not From Here follows 3 young Guatemalan children, which again is also a reminder that unaccompanied minors are children, right? They are children coming to this country. So it's 3 unaccompanied minors fleeing violence in their hometown, riding La Bestia. And so they have to travel from Guatemala through Mexico to get to the US. And so what I appreciated about this text that I haven't seen in other texts that talk about Central American migrations, and I'm saying this and then folks are gonna drop a whole bunch of books that do this, is the challenge to the Mexican state, right? And again, I want to emphasize that US, I'm still working on the formulation of how to say this right, but US empire has seeped into Mexico, which means that in terms of immigration, whatever deal is happening between the US and Mexico is at the cost and lives of Central Americans, right? And we're seeing this now a little bit more with Haitians immigrating through Mexico, trying to get to the United States, right? And so, again, what I appreciate about Torres Sanchez's book is the direct critique of the Mexican state in participating in the policing of Central American immigrants. And so Pulga is one of the main characters. He says, some don't want us here. We are to Mexico what Mexico is to the States. And I read that line and I was like, yo. Later in the novel, Pulga adds, Mexico doesn't want us more than the United States does. You'd be an immigrant here, Chico, and Chico's one of the other characters. If you try to work here, live here, whatever, Mexico will deport you right back too. And so I think this was the most succinct way that I saw in the novel, like really pointing to the violence that the Mexican state is inflicting on Central Americans on behalf of US empire, right? That it's a continual project of US imperialism to the benefit of Mexican immigrants. And again, as many of my panelists have said, right, and I'll reiterate again, right, it's to certain type of immigrants, right? Raices in Texas recently on their Instagram talked about the ways that like Black immigrants are much more policed, have higher bails, have longer detention holds. And so again, Mexico is participating in uplifting the US empire. I definitely recommend this book, read it. One of the other ways that I also see Chicanx children's literature challenging US empire or thinking about US imperialism is by placing focus on US citizens, the children, US citizens that are children. And one of the books that I think does that very well is Ernesto Cisneros' Ifren Divided. and thinking about the ways that this US imperialist project and this policing and brutality and violence in immigration impacts US citizens, right? And so again, even just as my panelists have mentioned, that even US citizens are not protected within this like American imaginary. And so we see this particularly with immigrants and US citizens. And so another recent book that came out, I definitely recommended. And so this description here is about, it's Ephraim, is the narrator talking about Ephraim after his, after something happened to his mother. I don't want to do spoilers. So he says, he'd heard about ICE setting up checkpoints and literally taking people off the streets. He'd heard about ICE helicopters carrying people out of their homes and hauling them away. He'd even heard of ICE making stops at Mexican-geared supermarkets and handcuffing anyone who couldn't prove they belonged. Whether the rumors were true or not, they sounded real enough to worry him. And so I highlight this passage particularly because, well, when I read it, it was super painful, right? Ephraim is a 12-year-old boy who's very much awoke to the idea of US imperialism and very much aware of ICE as a terrorist organization, right? This description of like ICE coming in and just lifting folks away and just making people disappear. If that is not terrorism, then I don't know what the fuck is, right? And so here you have this 12-year-old boy very much aware of the way that his own government, right, is making difficult for him to exist in his body, in his community, with his like cultural background, right? And so I find this daunting, right? And when I've written about this, I also talk about the empowerment of having this knowledge, right? Ephraim is a character that is researching these events, right? He is seeking out this information because he wants to know how to protect his family. And so I say that it's empowering, but it's also very painful that children need to put themselves in this position in the first place. I think this is the last book I'll talk about, is The Children's Picture Book by Juan Felipe Llera. And I've spoken about this book several times, and I am such a fan, and I really like this book. So Super Cilantro Girl is an older book, and it's about a young girl whose mother is stopped at the border and put in a detention center at the border between in Tijuana, I believe. And so her way to process and to understand what has happened to her mother is by transforming herself into a superhero, by imagining that she is this like giant, I think bus-sized girl with green everything, right? She appropriates the green to free her mother from the detention center. And so this is at that part where super spoiler alert, where Super Cilantro goes to free her mother. It says, "We'll make everything so green, the border will disappear." The 50-foot tall girl says, "Make it sin fronteras?" Mama asks. "Yes, just like our name." "Oops, I mean your name," the green girl replies. The officers stop the chase. They stumble out of the helicopters and patrol cars in all directions just to smell the green aromas. Lovely, they say. "Qué bonito," they say. They're even learning to speak Spanish. And so I highlight this passage because here again, like the imagination and like the embodiment of like healing that Super Cilantro Girl has taken to like literally and imaginatively break down walls, like the literal walls of the detention center to take out her mother, right? And the language barrier and the wall that is dividing Mexico and the US, I find super empowering. The reappropriation or like retaking, that's probably not the right word, the retaking of the color green is associated with green cards because Super Cilantro's girl's mom is a US citizen, now a US resident. She has a green card and she stopped anyway, right? And so what is important here, or what I try to argue, right, is that this embodiment of Cilantro Girl turning herself green, right, as opposed to the green cards, the green eyes of the police officers, and in contrast to like the grayness of the detention center, right? Again, thinking about the way that children and the representations of children's picture books challenge like US empires, to the point that children are literally trying to break down walls, right, to reunify with their families. Yeah, okay, I guess that's it. So here's my contact information. I know it was a lot and I spoke very quickly, but if you have any questions, want to hit me up, here's my information and here's where I stand. So thank you.
So thank you so much, Sonia. Again, I want to take this opportunity to thank all the panelists for their incredible and powerful presentations. I also want to take this moment to thank everyone who joined us. Thank you for your patience. We had, again, some technical issues in the beginning, but we are going to be releasing a recording of this event. So if you missed the first few minutes, please do view it, because we do we did give like in the opening we did give like an introduction about our title, like explaining the why we chose this title. We also talked about why we were very purposeful about organizing a panel of BIPOC women scholars and critics. But it is like 8:30. We're supposed to end at 8:30, so we'll probably just like wrap up with like one or two questions. And I was like, I had like a minute to I was able to monitor the chat on YouTube a little bit earlier, and there was like some some comments about this notion of like transnational solidarity, and I think all of us like talked about it a little bit. And again, like that's where the title is from, that the idea of Du Bois writing "The Color Line Belts the World" was he wanted Black and brown peoples around the world to unite and fight against white supremacy, because he saw that white supremacy and racism are global issues. And I'm just curious, because I guess like the way I want to frame this question of transnational work is thinking about cultural imperialism, or the role of children's and young adult literature in cultural imperialism. And more specifically, I keep thinking about like the example in the Philippines, where when I go home, I often see like these bookshelves that are full of like John Green titles, or Jenny Han books, and I wonder about like who is reading, like who is reading this, like what kind of Filipinos are reading this. And I often think about like like that what's being sold is this notion of a particular kind of American adolescence that's being kind of like sold around the world. And so I'm always suspicious about like I often think about like how this importation of US books into the Philippines, it's kind of like selling us a particular image of adolescence or childhood that is often about autonomy and independence, often about being carefree. That doesn't necessarily match the experiences of young people in the Philippines, or matches probably the aspirations of like middle class educated Filipinos, right? And particularly with ideas of childhood and adolescence. So okay, I'm kind of rambling here, but I'm just curious about like what your thoughts about like 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 how have you seen children's books enact cultural imperialism or push back against cultural imperialism?
I could talk a little bit about that. In terms of like my position in the diaspora, and working with authors sometimes in Puerto Rico, and also trying to draw attention to the books that are published in Puerto Rico and are from authors there, right? As opposed to like, how can we get more books from Scholastic into your libraries, and there's really a big problem in the Caribbean in general of like something called book dumping that you can learn more about. Anisium Journal has written about this and has shed light on this. Summer Edwards especially has written about this. But I think, one of the things we need to avoid doing as scholars positioned here, right, well, mainly living here, is avoiding our own like you know, going reverse colonialism, right? Where it's like, let me save you, let me help you, you know, and it's like, nobody needs that right now. Like, that's the last thing you need, especially if you're trying to make an intervention for your community, then the community that you love, right? You could absolutely do that and be a person of color and be from a country and be like, yeah, you know. And I think for me, it takes time to also get to know who those people are. So I've actually had authors reach out to me. I've had people really make an effort, because there's a list that I create every year, usually for Teaching for Change, where I've been putting books and recommending books that were published in Puerto Rico, especially, and like booksellers in Puerto Rico too. So for me, it's like, how can I use whatever platform I have to draw attention to those who are not going to have that visibility, and understanding that probably the second, if I move back to Puerto Rico, I probably will not have the visibility that I have here. And that's heartbreaking to think about, because even in the US Academy, with all its mess, there's a privilege that comes, right? There's a way that I become more visible and maybe have certain conversations with publishers and that sort of thing. But really, I think one of the things we need to advocate for is publishing books from authors there. You know, whatever countries we're interested in having solidarity with, I think we need to advocate for and own voices as in language, right? Like, why does everything have to be in English? That's a whole other story. You know, come on now. Okay, so anyhow, that's my, yeah.
I think I'll just add a little bit to that, and then Alia unmuted herself. The books that I talked about were written by Central Americans, right? So Jorge Guedes from El Salvador, Jenny Torres is Guatemalan, and so and Efren Cisneros and Juan Felipe Herrera are Chicanx Mexican American. And so I think that's one of the ways that we need to push right against these like U.S. imperial projects, or even challenge the ways that we support these imperialist projects. I'm not saying folks outside of that culture can't write. I don't want to get into that conversation. But I do want to highlight that we need more of these voices, right? The conversation around immigration needs more representations of Central American stories written by Central Americans, right? We need more stories written by Black immigrants, right? Not just about them, but by them, right? And so I think that's one of the ways that we can push ourselves in publishing, but even as like scholars, right, to write about the books that are written by these people, right? And I have different opinions about own voices and who created that and why we're using it, but that's just my little thing.
I was just going to say that, you know, Black diaspora is so rich and diverse, and so is indigeneity all across the world. Like, there's just so many stories that we need over here. And I wonder how we can push publishing, American publishing, to publish these stories, because they're there. You know, people try to say that, you know, well, people aren't writing the books. That's not true. You know, people are sharing their stories. How do we get them published here so that kids can read them? And to answer your question, Lara, about like, how can we push against imperialism? You know, as I was creating my talk, I was thinking about the fact that sometimes not sharing a story is a radical act. And the way that I'm thinking is the way that Indigenous peoples can choose what stories to tell and what not to. Deciding what you want to share with the world is powerful. And too many stories already have been co-opted by white authors. Like I said in the presentation, like so many of our shelves are full of white people's imaginations of Native Indigenous stories, taking up so much space. So it can be radical to just decide not to share your stories and keep it to yourself.
Okay, well, it is where it's like way past our our time. I just want to thank everybody. So once again, I want to thank our hosts, Paige Pagan of Lehigh University and Lidong Shang from Rutgers University Camden. So I want to thank Sonia Alejandra Rodriguez, Marilisa Jimenez Garcia, Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, and Alia Jones for being here, for making this happen. We imagined this panel coming together like a few months ago, and it literally started with like a text message I sent to Marilisa at 8:30 in the morning. Hey, want to do a panel? And now it came together. But it came together through collaboration and through collective action. And I'm really I don't think I would have been able to do this without the feedback, without the support of all these wonderful women. Thank you so much, and thank you to our audience for your patience. And please do help us circulate the recording once it becomes available. So once again, thank you, everyone. Stay safe and have a good night.